One of the most important things that you will have in your go bag is a really good whistle. So don't forget that. A whistle goes far, far, far beyond what your voice will do. So if you're in trouble, a whistle is what you want. So welcome everybody. This is really exciting. I am so pleased to see everybody here. And we're going to learn a lot about tsunamis and earthquakes today. That will affect all of us. It will affect the community and us personally. And it is not if, it is when. So the more you're prepared, the better you're prepared, the more you can react in a positive, logical way after a tsunami. So the last time we met was in March of 2020. We were the last meeting before the city was shut down with COVID. Dr. Allan was here, so he shut us down. And he's here to open us up today. My name is Linda Kozlowski. I am one of the founding members of EBCMB. And I'll talk in a few minutes about EBCMB. But since the last time we met, a lot of changes have happened. People have moved out. People have moved in. I'm not quite sure what the level is of our knowledge about tsunamis. So we are going to have a pop quiz. No grades, just prizes. And the first one to answer the question correctly gets a prize. So the first question is, what is a distant tsunami and how are we notified?
By siren.
Raise your hand. By sirens? Actually, I'm sorry. What? By apps? But what is a distant tsunami?
Is it far enough that we can react to it?
So it happens someplace else, but it does react. We are affected by it. And generally, in a distant tsunami, you have lots of time. You hear on the radio, you'll hear from your friends. It's not something that is urgent, and I get a lot of feedback. There's a lot of
Nixel is one of them.
Should I move? I'll stay on myself. Okay. So, Brad, could you give Mark one of those?
Yes.
It should be Nixel, right? Nixel?
Pardon?
The Nixel alert?
Nixel is one of the alerts that you'll get, absolutely, and signing up for Nixel is really important. What other ways would you hear about a distant tsunami?
Shake alert.
Pardon, say?
Shake alert.
Shake alert is a really good one, absolutely. Anybody else back here?
Yellow radio.
Yellow radio, yay! That's what I was looking for, all right. So interestingly enough, in 1964, Alaska had a 9.2 earthquake. And Alaska is positioned so that it directly affects our coastline. We have a distant tsunami, but in this case, the distant tsunami was dangerous. I don't know whether it was because it was so close or it was such a big earthquake, but 5 people died and there was a lot of damage in Cannon Beach. I've tried to figure out if anything happened here. I'm sure it did, but I haven't been able to figure out exactly what happened here. We had a distant tsunami in 2011, and for us in Manzanita, it was almost a non-event. So it can go from almost nothing to something. So you need, if there is a distant tsunami, you need to be aware of it. You need to be really cautious about it. How do we know if it's a local tsunami? Okay, wait, over here.
The earthquake.
The earthquake, right, so the shaking. There's no notice, there's nothing, there's no siren, it's the shaking beneath your feet. And what do?
Duck and cover.
You duck and cover first, we'll talk a little bit about that. And what's the next step after you drop, hold, and cover, and the shaking is stopped? Grab your go bag. All right, grab your go bag and head to safety. Fantastic. Okay, this is a trick question. Oh yeah, oh wait, we have a gift over here. And we have one for Mark over here. Okay. I marked that one, and the next one is a big one. Okay, so,
A big prize?
a big prize. So get ready. So how do we know that we had a 9.0 earthquake, January 20, I know, you're ready, I can tell. When did it happen? 1700, January 26th, I think it was 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock. And how do we know that we had a 9.2 earthquake?
Because it
Wait, let her answer.
There's ghost forest, there's soil samples,
That's part.
there's also records.
The records that you, I think that's probably how we know the absolute accuracy of it. But along with the ghost forest and all the other things, that was excellent. So, she gets a present. So how will you evacuate after a local tsunami? A, get in your car and go as fast as you can to the top of the mountain. Get on your bike and ride that way, or pick up your go bag and walk to your nearest assembly area. That was too easy. That was too easy.
You gave us the answer.
Yeah, I kind of did. Okay. What does CERT mean? And if you're CERT, don't answer. What does CERT mean? What does it stand for? Can you tell us?
Community Emergency Response Team.
All right, yay! Excellent. What are 3 things that you really should have in your go bag?
Whistle.
Listen, I need 3 things from one person. Oh, okay, what are the things? Whistle, flashlight,
And a blanket.
and a blanket. Great. Surprise. So what else should you have in your? What else should you have in your go bag? Food for 3 days would be great. Okay. Water, definitely water. And water filters would be great. Because you really are going to need water. You can last for a while without food. You really cannot last a long time without water. And after an ice storm, when most of the communications are down, what is the best way to communicate? Yellow radio! I got your trained! All right, a yellow radio. And this is an emergency radio. It's GMRS, but it can connect with anybody in the area. So yellow radio.
Same radios.
Yes?
So if you have a yellow radio, are you supposed to keep it plugged in and on all the time in order for people to use yellow radios?
No.
So if you don't know or didn't feel or anything, then it doesn't matter because it's not on, there's nobody communicating and you don't know something's happening.
So usually you know something. So for instance, in the ice storm that we just had, there's an ice storm, turn on your yellow radio. There's a big windstorm, turn on your yellow radio. Something happens. And one of the things that we have done, thanks to Brad Hart over here, is we have an activation program which activates all of the yellow radio leads that should be able to contact you if that happens. But we really suggest that you have a yellow radio and that you take a class. Karen Sarniker back there will be more than happy to tell you about it, but you can't have a radio without the class. Because these are emergency radios and they're only to be used.
No louder.
You need them right for an emergency. Okay. Okay, and this is a big one. And this is really important. The 3 cities have shelters. What are the shelters in Manzanita and Nehalem? Okay.
Calvary Bible.
Calvary Bible,
Manzanita.
Manzanita,
District.
NCRD,
Yeah.
along with the church.
Forgot the Wheeler.
And what's the wheel?
Forgot the Wheeler.
Upper Wheeler Park.
No.
Upper Wheeler Park.
It's a city hall. Okay, thank you all. So do you feel like you know something about it? I mean, you guys responded really well. So I want to take just a quick minute.
One second, please. We can't hear her from the back. just so you know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sergeant.
I don't have my list.
So I'll.
Mine's working, not your mine. Sean's got a whistle.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? All right. We have some celebrities here that I would like, some dignitaries, very important people here. We have Commissioner Mary Faith Bell. If you would stand up. We have Commissioner Olson and his wife Patty. We have Dan Keyes, who is our new Tillamook Parks Director. We have Horney. Tom Horney, who wrote a book called
The next tsunami.
The Next Tsunami, about the tsunami in Cannon Beach. Is that correct?
Seaside Kennedy.
Seaside Cannon Beach. So you want to stand up? You're on the seaside. We have Mary Kampf, who is the mayor of Cannon Beach. And we have the person everybody is going to want to know in an emergency, Randy Thorpe. Would you-
By the way, scotch is the first thing in your go bag.
What's that?
Scotch.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you now a little bit about the Emergency Volunteer Corps. I won't take too long, but I think it's important to understand. Oh my God. She is going to make me pay for this, I know. Could you stand up, our mayor? I know. Thank you, thanks for letting me know. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origin story of the Emergency Volunteer Corps. So in 2007, we had hurricane force winds that came through our area and devastated everything. We couldn't get out, we couldn't go north, we couldn't go south. We lost our electricity, trees were down everywhere, we had aging demographics, and our police chief, fire chief was in the Emergency Operations Center for 36 hours straight with no help. Wow. And there was somebody across the street that wanted to help him, but didn't know how. So that was actually the beginning of the Emergency Volunteer Corps. We had a community meeting, the three communities. We all got together. We realized that we did discover what is the most important thing in an emergency, and that is neighbors, helping neighbors. We worked together. We survived it. We took care of the aging demographics, but we had no plan. We had no way to have supplies stored or to be really prepared. So when we got together in the meeting, we decided that was really important. We essentially formed the Emergency Volunteer Corps, and the very first thing we did was have a program called Map Your Neighborhood, and that was the beginning of our organization, which is really Neighbors Helping Neighbors. Can you switch this? So what we're about creating a culture of preparedness, and we do that. I'm trying. Tell me if you can't hear me. Tell me. Okay. So it's very important that we had a vision in terms of creating a culture of preparedness, and these are the things. This is our mission: to teach and encourage personal preparedness, to demonstrate, promote, and measure community emergency preparedness, to support our region with technical expertise focused on evaluation of the best practices for community resilience, and avidly support our first responders. So in order to do that, we have two divisions. One is focused on preparedness, and one is focused on response. Preparedness is really a personal community thing. One of the things that I think we all understand now is there's not going to be any white horse coming in from Portland. The cities can't take care of you. The county can't take care of you. You've got to be able to take care of yourself. And so this is really the important lesson that we need to leave with today. So in preparedness, we have 3 levels of preparedness. The first is prepare yourself. It's important to have a go bag. Have a go bag for yourself and your family and your animals. I always put a go bag in my car because you never know where you're going to be, and having a go bag in your car is really important. Know where to go. Now if you're at home, it's probably not that difficult. Where's the nearest assembly area? Where can you get to safety? But if you're in Tillamook, where are you going to go? If you're on your way to Astoria and you're going through Seaside, where do you go? It's really important to think about that when you're traveling. Have an emergency plan, and that emergency plan has to do with reconnecting after an emergency. If I happen to be in Portland and my husband is here, how are we going to connect? What's our plan? What are we going to do? Have an external resource outside of the area that you can contact that knows where you are and how you are. And my understanding is if you text fairly early or fairly soon, text tends to work right after an emergency. So use your text. Next is prepare your household. I know you've heard of shelter in place. What we call it is camping at home. And if you think about camping, camping isn't that scary. I mean, most of us camp. So understanding that your house may not be solid, you may not have electricity, you more than likely won't have water. So how are you going to camp at home? And think about what you would need to do that. Have a stockpile of emergency food, and this is really easy to do. When you go to the store, just get an extra couple of cans. Freeze-dried works really well, but think about what you will need without water and without heat. And just as an aside, we have in February, we have what we call the Top Chef. And the Top Chef, you need to make a meal without water or without heat. And we currently have our Top Chef here today. Christopher, would you please stand up? So if you need any hints, I would have bought what he made in a restaurant for $20. It was really good. No water, no heat. It was great. Water, sanitation, and hygiene. We have a class that talks about water, sanitation, and hygiene. Really great class. Sanitation and hygiene are really important. The last thing you want to do is get sick during an emergency, so hygiene becomes really important, as does sanitation. The likelihood that we will have water is pretty high.
Can't hear.
The likelihood that we will have...
Mike went out.
I can hear it.
No, it's out now.
Does it still work? Is it working?
I don't know. Is she the problem?
Yeah, give me that. Give me that.
Okay, can you hear me? Is that better? Okay. So water, sanitation, and hygiene. The likelihood is that you will have water. I mean, we have water, but will it be clean? It won't be. So making sure that you're able to have fresh and clean water is really important. And we have a wonderful class that teaches you that. Lastly is the community. Preparing the community. This goes back to that 2007 storm. Prepare your neighbor. Neighbors help your neighbor. That is the foundation of everything. So right now, in this Nehalem Bay region, we have about 13 clusters. Those are groups of neighbors that get together, decide where their evacuation site is, get equipment in that vacation site, learn how they're going to communicate, and then they congregate there after an emergency. So they have the social connection that is so important and support after an emergency. And we call that prepare your neighborhood. It's really Natural Neighborhood on steroids. It's really great. Stay informed with emergency communication. The emergency communication is the yellow radio. I just talked about, is the GMRS radio in the Nehalem Bay region. It reaches throughout Nehalem Bay and is an excellent tool. And support our community shelters and warming centers. Terrific organization in our shelters, thanks to Velda Handler. We have the shelters supplied. We have volunteers that are within walking distance so that we are able to provide the shelter if there's a major emergency and you need help. So the next division is community and first responders support. So in this area we have great responders. We have terrific fire volunteers. We have an adequate police force.
Friday.
Yeah, right. So their focus is going to be on major community needs, and what we do and what we train for is to be boots on the ground to support our great police and our terrific fire department. So by doing that, we have 3 divisions that do that. One is the Medical Reserve Corps, and the Medical Reserve Corps is a combination of doctors and nurses, some retired, some full-time, that understand how to deal in wilderness medicine. They know how to set up on an assembly site. They train. They work together. They know how to work together. They've got supplies. They've got as much medical supplies as you can have to be prepared for an emergency. And if you got a vaccine during the COVID issue in Tillamook County, you got it from the Medical Reserve Corps. Tillamook County could bring the vaccine in, but they didn't have the capability of giving the shots, and the Medical Reserve Corps did that. Community emergency response teams, they really are the boots on the ground. They're the ones that work most closely with the police and fire. We have a couple of special events that we do, particularly with the police. If there's a lost child or a lost person, the police and CERT work really closely together. If there's a major fire, the CERT supports the fire and helps them. They do things that the firefighters could do but really don't need to do. So they're the support behind the scenes. And then emergency communication, we're lucky because those yellow radios are also ham radios. And what is necessary when you're in an emergency in the Nehalem Bay is we've got to reach Randy, because Randy is the keeper of all information during an emergency. He's the one that gets us our supplies. He's the one that makes sure that he needs to understand what's going on in the Nehalem Bay. And so the ham radio operators are key to getting to Randy.
Excuse me, you don't have DART? The dogs for the animals?
No, we don't.
Oh,
Do you have DART?
he's the DART. He's DART.
We'd love to hear about that afterwards. All right, so I would now like to introduce a really wonderful friend of Nehalem Bay. He was here in March of 2020, and thank goodness he's back today. He's a geomorphologist. He is a graduate of the University of Canterbury. He has his PhD. He did postdoc at OSU. He has a wonderful accent. He has been with DOGAMI, which is really a major part of the state government that helps mapping for our area. And he does all of the mapping. He's been there since 2001, does research, helped us with our signage, helped us with what we needed to provide information to our community, and has done just a great job. And he works very closely with Laura Gable, which is kind of his DOGAMI partner, and they've been wonderful for us. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr.
Okay. That's just forward. Great.
Ah, thank you. The box. I'm not sure what's wrong with the sound.
All right. Well, look, thank you again. It's wonderful to be back here in Manzanita. It's been a long time. I do come up here on a seasonal basis, but for some other related work that we do. So if you ever see a 8-wheel orange ATV that's driving up and down on the beach, and they look like they're driving mad, that's us. We're collecting data. We're legitimate. We're not doing anything naughty or untoward or anything like that. So, but that's another job. So I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here today and see a lot of friendly faces who I've seen in the past and a lot of new people, which is fantastic. And first and foremost, I would really like to thank Nehalem EVC. You guys all of you collectively do an incredible job. And it certainly makes our lives easier, and we can definitely sleep better knowing of the types of preparation and activities that you all practice regularly, and that's phenomenal. If we could clone what you do in every community along the Oregon coast, I think we would be in a really strong place. And so that's the challenge before us, is how we can actually replicate groups like yourselves elsewhere in this county, but also elsewhere on the coast. So what I'm going to talk about is some work that's been ongoing for decades now, looking at and unlocking the secrets of tsunami. And so I wanted to point out my colleague, Rob Witter, who's actually on the left there holding that Vibracore pole. And Rob is one of the foremost experts in tsunami paleoseismology, which basically means studying deposits left behind by great earthquakes and the product being the tsunamis themselves. And Rob is actually in my position in 2010 and was, effectively he was the lead developing the tsunami program, and all the maps that you see today was the product of the work that Rob led, as well as several other key people. George Priest, who some of you probably know, he's a geologist and has been advocating for tsunami preparation since the mid-1990s. He did the original maps along the entire Oregon coast that was eventually adopted as part of a regulatory line. And then obviously you probably heard of people like Chris Goldfinger, who's a geologist out of Oregon State, and many other folks, all of whom really collaborated to assimilate the tremendous amount of information and knowledge about great earthquakes along the Cascadia subduction zone. So what I'm going to talk about initially in the first half of the presentation is really about the signs that people are looking for in terms of how we go about determining what's caused these ghost forests or has produced the sediments that we see in cores and things like that. And there are 3 examples here. A little fuzzy, so I apologize, but on the upper right there is a raised coast, and you can see a person circled there, and that was actually from an earthquake in Chile in 2010. And you can see that person is probably about 6 feet, give or take, and you can see the strand line, and so this is an uplifted shoreline, the product of that earthquake. Down below is one of the ghost forests up in Copalis River in Washington State that Brian Atwater really started presenting and talking about, and really started a lot of the fundamental geologic investigations in the Pacific Northwest. And one of these ghost forests being an area that's been subsided and the ocean has come in and flooded in, but it's preserved the trees in situ in the landscape. And then over time, silts and sands and things like that start to accumulate around it as material is transported onto that landscape, and as well as the land starting to rebound and rise again. And then the bottom part is obviously a lot of the work that we do, digging pits and putting in cores to try to identify the deposits. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a history, and then I'll talk how we came about doing the modeling work and the various inputs, and then I'm really spending the latter half of the talk going through a bunch of questions that have come up repeatedly that perhaps will help guide any discussion after my presentation, but it's a lot of the take-home messages that I think is most important in terms of your own respective preparations. Point out in the upper right there's a pie chart, and we can see that in terms of causes of tsunamis, the overwhelming majority, about 70% there, is the product of earthquakes. A small percentage are related to submarine landslides, or even could be subaerial landslides. Subaqueous landsliding is something that's of tremendous concern in the Gulf states and off the East Coast, where there's been evidence of really great extreme tsunami type scenarios. Volcanoes is another one. The Hunga Tonga event a few years ago is the most recent example, and then of course there are other factors that we don't really want to talk about, like meteorites and things like that, where it's all carnage. So there's obviously there are definitely written records around the world about great earthquakes and tsunami inundation, and so perhaps the most common ones that people think about are those that are in Japan, and these stones basically portend of the occurrence of these past great disasters. So this is the famous 869 Jogan stone that describes the effects of a great earthquake accompanied by luminous phenomenon in coastal areas that were illuminated in the dark. Sometime after severe seismic shocks, a gigantic tsunami reached the coast and invaded the entire Sendai Plain. This is the same place that the most recent Tohoku event took place in 2011. And then rising seawater flooded the town, causing large loss of life. So we don't have records like that in the Pacific Northwest. But geologists actually in early 2000 started, they were thinking, well, Native Americans have lived in this part of the world for millennia, and they probably have stories about great earthquakes. And so Ludwin started investigating the stories that were passed down by Native American tribes, particularly in Oregon, Washington, and then up in British Columbia as well. And so she collated a lot of evidence, and one of the interesting things was that she found in several of these communities stories about the effects of a severe shaking and then flooding that was taking place. And it turns out that event sort of brackets the 1700 tsunami that impacted our coastline. And so there were little stories like they had practically no way or time to save themselves. I think it was the nighttime that the land shook. I think a big wave smashed into the beach. The Pachana Bay people were lost. The day who lived at Ma'ita's house up against the hill, the wave did not reach them because they were on high ground. Because of that, they came out alive. They did not drift out to sea with the others. So stories like that were some of the early signs for scientists to begin to sort of look more deeply into the landscape. So this is a fantastic example of, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, Kiel in Chile in 1960. So this is the before the 1960 earthquake. 1960 is the largest earthquake on record in recent history. It was about a magnitude 9.5. So it's a big event. So you can see, obviously, well-populated landscape. And then this was the scene after the event. So several things become immediately apparent. One is that, and I can perhaps toggle back. Oops. So if you look at it again, so you can see the creek, or the estuary up in the upper left there. You can now see how the ground has been ripped up in various places. Obviously the homes and everything have been stripped out. There's now a tremendous amount of flooding in the landscape. You can see sediments that have been carried over onto the landscape. So all of this were early signs that geologists were looking for, and we're thinking, well, great, this is something that maybe there's evidence of these types of events if we dig down into the soil and see what we can find. So it was events like this that really started to drive a lot of the geologic investigations. Of course, the other one is the Alaska 1964 event, and Tom can speak to this with respect to the effects in Seaside, Oregon, and perhaps he can comment on that after the presentation. But again, this disaster really highlights a lot of the significant signs that we use today. So in the upper left there is Portage Garage in summer of 1964 after the tsunami. The land has been dropped and flooding has occurred. On the right is the same location taken in 1996. And so you can see a remarkable transformation as the landscape is actually being uplifted as strain starts to build again towards the next great earthquake. So it's these types of cycles that start to sort of highlight the evidence. In the bottom middle there, you can see, basically you've got a standing tree, the landscape has dropped, the ocean floods in, and then sediments accumulate, and over time that land starts to rise. So it's captured there schematically. And this is all, beautifully documented in Brian Atwater's book on the orphan tsunami of 1700. And I really highly recommend, if you can find a copy, and take a read. It's very light reading. It's really quite a fascinating insight into how geologists investigate the landscape. But importantly, it actually took the evidence from the Pacific Northwest, and then it looked at the records in Japan, and using those combinations of sleuthing and so on, we're able to really narrow down the timing of the 1700 event. So in 1964, so I've circled Portage, which was up in that upper left side there. And so that was an area where it had been subsided. Well, about 150 miles to the southeast, we see at the sort of juncture there, there's a line, and so here's an area where the ground is actually uplifted by 8 meters. So that's a pretty substantial increase in change in elevation. And you can see there's a barnacle line that's identified here. And these types of products actually were really some of the foundation for a lot of the early investigations into plate tectonics. Flafka is a very famous geologist who described the impacts of the 1964 event in great detail, and then went down into Chile and started to explore the effects down there, and from that, really started to push forward the argument about the fact that we sit on these rafts of crust that are floating about on top of molten lava, etc., and that at certain junctures you'll find fault lines actually being subducted underneath other crusts. And then we also know, of course, other factors such as spreading ridges and faults like the San Andreas that are very different. So what was the local effect? Well, this is a series of images from 1964 in Cannon Beach. And so in the upper left there, so you can see Ecola Creek, and there's a white dashed line, and highlighted in the square there is a house that's been called out. And then there's actually the bridge that's actually been carried upriver by the tsunami event. There was a lot of destruction in downtown Cannon Beach there. There were houses that were lifted off their foundation. And there were 4 people killed at Beverly Beach down in Newport. So again, evidence like this really started to help people want to investigate things a little bit more carefully. So Linda talked about distant tsunami events. So we can differentiate tsunamis into both what we call local events. This is something that would happen along our coastline versus those that are far field or in remote areas. So a great example, obviously, the 1964 Alaska event up in the upper right there, to the sort of top left of where I've circled is Cascadia. So this is, of course, a pretty standard map of plate tectonics. And what I've highlighted in those yellow bands there, we can see the little jagged lines is areas of subduction. And these are areas where the Pacific plate is diving under other types of plates. So obviously in Cascadia, it's actually the Juan de Fuca that's being subducted underneath the North American plate. But all of these zones are regions that can actually experience great earthquakes. Historically, on the Oregon coast, we've had about 30 distant tsunami events since the mid-1850s. And we have records of this based on observations from people living in coastal areas that experienced these events over the years. The big ones was 1946, 1960, which I've talked about, and then 1964. And I should point out that in places like Seaside and elsewhere down on the south coast, we had about 8 to 12 feet of flooding, of water flooding across the landscape in those environments, because this event actually coincided with a high tide. And of course, the most recent event was the 2011 that really didn't impact the northern part of the Oregon coast, but actually caused quite a bit of damage down on the very southern Oregon coast, particularly down by Brookings. Brookings Harbor experienced about $20 million worth of damage because the tsunami impacted the marina there. One of the boats actually broke off its moorings and started slamming into other boats. The other site that has historically been very responsive to distant type tsunamis is Crescent City down in Northern California. On the central Oregon coast, there was a little bit of damage in Depot Bay as well. The main thing to appreciate about distant tsunami events is that our closest primary source, as Linda pointed out, is the eastern portion of the Aleutians. That's the most likely next area that could generate a big earthquake. And so that's the one we worry about in terms of a distant event. So from modeling work that Rob's team did, and then we've been doing more recently, I can tell you that it takes about 4 hours for that wave to reach our coastline. So you have time to respond, and you're going to hear about this either through social media. If you live in a community that has sirens will be triggered eventually. You'll get it through a wide variety of different forms of media. I should point out that the way the tsunami warning centers work, of which there are two, one based up in Palmer, Alaska, and then one in Honolulu. The one up in Palmer, Alaska actually services our part of the world, so that's the one we listen to. And it takes them about 5 minutes to figure out whether the earthquake, to figure out how big the earthquake is first. It then takes them about another 20 minutes to actually really dial in on the epicenter of the quake and to figure out how big the earthquake was, whether it was actually a thrust type event, and whether it's tsunamigenic. Typically, anything less than about a magnitude 7 in a thrust type event is not going to trigger a tsunami. Anything over a 7 is about their threshold when they start to actually get concerned. So when you start hearing about magnitude 7s and 8s along these subduction zones, if they're in the right placement, then those are the ones that we start to be concerned about. So it takes them about 20 minutes to actually figure all that out. And then they'll issue an information statement or a watch or a warning, etc. Actually, it goes information, a watch, an advisory, and then a warning. So you have about 4 hours from Alaska. It's about 9.5 hours from Japan. And then obviously as you go further down into the Pacific there, it's much longer than that. So the Hunga Tonga event was, I think, around 11 or so hours. So there's time for this one. And the most important thing with a distant type tsunami event is to ensure that you're not on the beach at the time the tsunami is arriving. So you want to actually make sure that you are removing yourselves from the beach, and then you're using our distant evacuation zone, which on our evacuation maps is the orange zone. And so you want to make sure you're out of that zone. And so the point being is that with a distant event, it's primarily going to impact low-lying areas. It's the beach, it's the ports and harbors that really have the greatest potential for seeing damage. So I mentioned briefly, so in Cascadia, we have the Wanda Fuca Plate, which is moving in a northeasterly direction underneath the North American plate there. So the schematic on the upper right gives you a sense of the sort of geometry. This is kind of, we go. It's a little pointed this one.
Look at that when you're pointing.
Oh, look at that one when I'm pointing. Yeah. Okay. It's too complicated for me. So it's diving down. And the main point is that there's a region in which the tectonic plate is actually locked because of friction. And then over time, strain accumulates. We have essentially uplift going on along our coastline where it's gradually being bent and warped. And then eventually that strain gives way and we have a mega thrust event. We're also obviously conscious about other types of earthquakes in the region. These are crustal type events that tend to occur inland. And I should point out, so in the map on the left there, so that's a product that's been recently put together by the USGS. It's a compilation showing all magnitude 4 earthquakes and greater up to, I think, about a 6 or a 7. And what really jumps out at you right away is that you can see, obviously, the Wanda Fuca plate. There's that sort of squiggle or zigzag offshore our coastline. That solid black line is basically the Cascadia deformation front. That's where it dives below the North American plate. And you can see that as you go further westward out onto the ocean there are little sort of white lines with arrows pointing in opposite directions. So those are areas where we've got spreading ridges. So it's basically the Earth's crust in those areas is very thin. It's about 8 kilometers, give or take. And we have magma being extruded along those fault zones. And it's an area of tremendous seismicity. So that's why you see lots and lots of little earthquakes happening out there. So when you hear about a magnitude 4 or a magnitude 5 event that's happening off our coastline, invariably it's along these offshore faults. And so they're the ones that we don't really, we shouldn't be panicking about those ones. I think they happen all the time, and we shouldn't be too concerned about those. Obviously, when things start to happen on the actual subduction zone itself, that's when we get concerned. I'm going to skip that one. So I mentioned various forms of evidence. So this is, again, from Brian Atwater's book. And so this is Kapalis River here capturing, essentially the general sort of model that is applied in many other estuaries up and down the coastline. So we can see essentially a contact that's labeled tsunami deposits. And then above that is so that's the actual sediment that it would be spread across the estuary there at the time. The land has been dropped, and then you've got intertidal muds that begin to accumulate as strain builds towards the next event. So this can actually happen, and there could be evidence for this showing multiple cycles of these types of occurrences. And so this is Johns River, also up in Washington State in Grays Harbor. And so this particular site beautifully captures that exact process, showing the evidence of 7 of these great earthquakes over time. More locally, Bradley Lake down just south of Bandon has one of the most phenomenal records of great earthquakes. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. Subduction zone earthquakes, both full margin as well as what we call partial ruptures, where only part of the subduction zone fails. And it's has been essentially a barometer for a lot of the mapping and let me rephrase that. It's been a barometer for a lot of the modelling work that we've done over the years, because we can actually calibrate it against the data that's in these deposits that are shown up here. So all those little squiggly, so you've got the grey lines, all those lines on the left there represent cores that were dug across in a profile. All the yellows correspond to tsunami sands that have been very carefully evaluated in terms of their grain sizes, their characteristics. If there's any material that's in them that can be extracted, that's vegetative, then you can actually date those types of deposits and come up with ages and approximations. So there's what we call the on-land paleoseismic record, and so that's made up of a variety of different types of evidence. These include the co-seismic subsidence, so these are the buried soils, the actual tsunami deposits themselves, so the sediments that are carried onto the landscape. But there may be other signs like liquefaction, where the ground shakes, especially in wet areas. If it's very loose material, we can have great degree of shaking. It's like jelly. If you go jump out on the sand there down near the intertidal zone, you'll see water starts to pop up and things like that. So that actually leaves certain signs in the landscape as well. And then there may also be landslide deposits. So there's other groups that are looking for evidence of these other factors in our landscape. We can use a variety of techniques to date the deposits. These could be tree rings, which is one of the best forms, where you can get down to very meticulous dates. And then radiocarbon, of course, that provides sort of a bracket, a minimum and maximum range for those deposits. So we can do this at one site, and that tells us something that's unique about that site. It tells us a story about that individual location. But the key thing here is it's not just one site, it's actually looking at multiple sites. So coherence, i.e. the presence of these deposits in multiple estuaries with comparable dates is telling us something about the scale or the magnitude of this particular event here. And this is a product that Garrison Laney, she's a professor up at Washington State who's been doing a lot of work up there. And so this is evidence, all the sites of evidence for the 1700 event. So I'm not expecting you to understand this map other than say that all these different sites, this spans several thousand years. I think it's about 9,000 years. It's really hard to see on the 7,000 years of record there, and showing the length of records at discrete stations, and the various vertical lines there are highlighting key great earthquakes over time. And again, the point here is the coherence of these events across the entire landscape. That's the important thing. This just really highlights that there's been an enormous body of work that's been centered in the Pacific Northwest, and that work is ongoing. So I talked about the on-land record, so we can actually go offshore and do similar things. So Chris Goldfinger, who's a marine geologist, professor at Oregon State University, has made a career out of investigating these offshore deposits. So he's done extensive coring basically at the ends of all the submarine canyons along the entire Cascadia margin. So the idea is that when we have one of these great earthquakes, it shakes the ground and it causes landslides, submarine landslides, and those sediments are then carried down into the sort of abyssal plains out beyond the continental shelf where they accumulate. And those patterns and trends and spatial coherence of those events, again, provide us clues about these megathrust events. Chris's team, again, does very detailed mapping of these deposits using CT imagery to really get into the nuts and bolts of the sediments and so on. They look at magnetics and various other factors as well, and then they can date material. So again, a tremendous amount of work. It's painstaking work that has accumulated over time. So once again, you know, one of these sites is interesting. Multiple sites really starts to tell us something about what's going on. And so this is an example across the full Cascadia margin of the coherence between deposits and dating of these deposits, indicating megathrust events. Based on that, Chris basically postulated a series of types of rupture events. We can differentiate between what we call these full margin ruptures, where the entire 600-mile length of the Cascadia subduction zone basically fails, producing super large earthquakes. These events happen on average about 500 years, but the range could be as much as anywhere from 100 years to over 1,100 years. That's the gap in time in that geologic record. But on average, it's about 500 years. Keep in mind, 1700, so that's 324 years ago. So, you know, we're definitely well advanced as strain is continuing to build. Within this record, there's also other what we call partial type events. So, for example, south of Cape Blanco, in places like down by the Coquille estuary, there's evidence of another 20. There's evidence of 26 partial rupture type events. So these are smaller earthquakes, probably in the magnitudes mid 7s to low 8s. The full margin ones are typically in the 8s to low 9s. So based on that, we have this tremendous record, 19 great earthquakes over the last 10,000 years, averaging somewhere around 530 years. That's if you use the full on-land offshore record. Other people have done some recent work. So Brian Atwater, based on work that he did in Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay, came up with an average of 500 to 540. Other people, Allan Nelson published a paper not too long ago. It's somewhere around 500 years. So 500 years is probably a reasonable approximation for these full margin events. I'm going to skip that. So okay, so how do we actually translate that into meaningful products to address hazards and reduce the potential for loss of life? So we need to be able to simulate these types of earthquakes and produce appropriate maps that can be actually then turned into products for people to use. So we utilize high-end sophisticated tsunami modeling in order to do that. It requires one of two approaches. So we call these a deterministic approach or deterministic modeling or probabilistic. The difference between the two is with a deterministic modeling, we basically have to define events of certain sizes. And so in the case of the work that we did within DOGAMI, we classify these into what we call t-shirt sizes. So there's a small, a medium, a large, an extra large, and an extra, extra large. And so when you look at the maps, the final maps, the yellow zone there is associated with the extra, extra large, the biggest potential earthquake scenario for Cascadia. If we do probabilistic modeling, rather than running 5 or 15 type scenarios, we run many hundreds to even potentially thousands. So when Rob and others were first starting off down there, we didn't have the computing capacity to do that. Today we do. So there are folks at the University of Oregon who are running simulations on the order of tens of thousands of potential scenarios. And there's actually work that's being funded now through the National Science Foundation to bring a lot of focus into the Cascadia region to really refine an understanding of that paleoseismic record, all those cores and so on, but then to really also refine understanding of the overarching geodesy of the region and the geophysics of the plates themselves in this region. And then there's folks doing tsunami modeling. So what I can tell you right now is that there is a tremendous amount of effort and work going into further research in this area. That's really quite exciting and will drive future modeling in the next 10 to 20 years. But anyway, at the time we couldn't do the probabilistic stuff. So we chose to do a deterministic approach. And so a lot of that was guided by, again, knowledge of the paleoseismology, so knowledge of these events and their timing. We had information about the co-seismic response from the more recent scenarios. So like the 1700 is one of the best constrained events in the geologic record. And so we could actually, based on our t-shirt sizes, so these small, middle, which are highlighted, so small is in the dark blue, medium is in the light blue in the upper left there, large is in the sort of darker orange or yellow, and then extra large is in the upper large there. So they correspond to the number of events in those bins. So it turns out the medium scenario, there's about 10 of those in the geologic record. In the large scenario, there's 3, and the extra large has only been one of those in the 10,000 year record. So that's how we actually came about constraining these big events and ultimately generating these t-shirt classifications. We then need to know about the geophysics. How are these faults going to rupture? And so we use what's called a megasplay, where as a fault ruptures, the energy that's released can be actually translated onto other secondary faults that are offshore on the continental shelf. And they tend to actually accentuate the tsunami that's generated. So you actually get much greater uplift in the offshore region out on the outer shelf there that produces basically a bigger wave. So we ran models using that as a model, and then obviously other types of rupture mechanisms. I should point out that obviously the Tohoku event in 2011, really one of the most intensely studied tsunami events and earthquake events in the world, and that's really has driven a lot of the fundamental research in the last few years, and again is actually feeding into some of the future work that we're heading down towards ourselves. We then take all that information, we run simulations to see what the tsunami does in terms of the timing of the waves along our coastline, associated with all these different scenarios, and then from that we have to make decisions about which event should ultimately be used to actually turn into evacuation maps. We do ground truthing of those events against known geophysical or paleoseismic data that's collected in various estuaries. So this is a great example of in Ecola Creek there up at Canna Beach. They were really actually the model for a lot of the work that ended up scaling up along the entire Oregon coast. And so we can actually look at the existing deposits, compare how our model simulations perform. If they're matching, then we're doing a good job in terms of replicating what nature might have produced. But keep in mind that the deposits themselves really only tell you the minimum extents of the tsunami event itself. You can never actually fully define the maximum extents from those deposits because there's so much uncertainty in them. So you then have to make assumptions about factoring in additional conservatism. So a series of questions here, just leading more into the second half of the talk. And so these are things that I know folks are always thinking about. So how long will the shaking last? Well, it depends. It depends on how big the rupture is. So in the case of the great earthquake in 2004, the Sumatra Andaman one, which was a magnitude 9.2, that ruptured basically 1,300 kilometers of coastline. So a very comparable size to the full length of Cascadia. That one took about 10 minutes of actual earthquake shaking. The 1964 Alaska event which ruptured about 800 kilometers, actually lasted about 3 minutes. So quite a big difference between the two. And so there's a few other examples there that give you a sense of what might occur. So in the darkish blue, cyan color, I've labeled 3 minutes. And then at the upper end, it's about 5 minutes. And that's purely based on just the length of the subduction zone. So we think it's probably somewhere in the order of 3 to 5 minutes is not unreasonable. It's a long time. So ultimately it depends on the length of the rupture. If we have a partial rupture happening on the very southern Oregon coast, we would expect probably an earthquake up here. You would probably feel some shaking. The shaking would probably be on the order of tens of seconds to maybe a minute or minute and a half, somewhere on that order, but substantially shorter because it would be a smaller rupture. So how strong will the shaking be? Well, again, it depends on where you are, and it depends on the rock that's underneath you. So, and it depends on your proximity to the subduction zone. So down on the southern Oregon coast, they're located much, much closer to the subduction zone. And so they can expect to experience very, very severe shaking. So on the right there, Macaulay intensity scale, it's a qualitative scale that's much more useful for the general public to understand in terms of the degree of type of shaking. So they've classified it into various classes. So we would expect to see in southwest Oregon coast somewhere on the order to severe to violent shaking, lasting that length of time, 3 to 5 minutes. And under those sort of circumstances, buildings would be, particularly unreinforced masonry type buildings, would probably be collapsing. And whereas wooden type buildings, the good news, tends to survive and ride out the earthquakes much, much better. In the very northwest part of the Oregon coast, we would expect to see somewhere on the order of strong to severe. And again, depends on proximity and what's underneath us. But the conditions will be severe shaking, obviously for an extended period of time. Will there be aftershocks? Yes. So you have a great earthquake. It's going to take some time for things to settle down. So in the case of the Tohoku, Japan event, that produced about 2,500 earthquakes, aftershocks within the first 25 hours after the great earthquake. And I should point out, so of these, 3 of them were magnitude 7s, and then about 60 were magnitude 6s. So these are large, these are still very significant events. So this is going to go on for some period of time. The main thing to appreciate is that obviously as time goes by, the rate of the number of earthquakes begins to decrease fairly rapidly. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, at day 50, you mightn't experience a magnitude 6 or a magnitude 7 again. We know that happens. But the point is that there'll be a lot of aftershocks after an event like this. So what will be the impact? Well, this is something we've been spending a lot of time evaluating over the past few years. And so the image on the left is estimates of fatalities for basically every community along the Oregon coast. We've focused on 3 of our earthquake scenarios: the medium, which is the most common, a large, and then the XXL, which is obviously used for evacuation purposes. So what I can tell you is that there's about 224,000 residents on the coast. We experience about 200,000 to 400,000 visitors. That's the challenge. That's a huge challenge for every community, is how do you actually manage that, especially obviously on a beautiful day like today. Of those, about anywhere from 24,000 to 60,000 are basically in a tsunami zone, so are exposed. And then in terms of visitors, again, it's about 30,000 to 100,000. So that variance is because of simply whether you use a medium scenario or the XXL. In terms of fatalities, under our medium scenario, at the low end, somewhere on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 people. And that's basically thinking it's just going to be residents, which is totally unrealistic. So the upper end is somewhere on the order of about 16,000, because that's when we start to include visitors. And then it scales up there from there pretty substantially to as much as 14,000 residents in the biggest earthquake. And then when you factor in visitors, it climbs even more. These are terrible, scary numbers, but these are numbers that we need to be thinking about and planning for. And the reason for that is that there are ways to mitigate against loss of life. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. Point out that in 2011, in the Japan event, 18,500 people were killed in that earthquake. This is one of the most prepared countries in the world. And so that's the standard. The standard we need to be going is towards where Japan is. And I should point out, obviously the difference between in terms of the large number of fatalities there. They have over 1 million people in the tsunami zone. So it's order of magnitude bigger. And so you need to keep that in perspective. But they successfully evacuated the bulk of their population. Yes, a lot of people died, and overwhelmingly those people were killed by the tsunami, not the earthquake. We can expect to see a lot of people being displaced, and these will be on the order of tens of thousands. I should point out that in the Japan event, 450,000 people were displaced. 9 years later, there were still 45,000 people who didn't have homes. So that's the challenge, another challenge. And then, of course, massive building losses. The numbers that we put here for Oregon are lowballing. I can tell you that right now. They're probably on the order of more likely 100 million. All these are considering building damages. They don't consider content within buildings and various other factors. So they're probably lowballing fairly substantially. So the impact will be great, of course. And that's why it's important to prepare as we go forward towards the next event. So these examples here obviously highlight the types of impacts. These are obviously very famous examples. I think the most scary one that I think I use to highlight the case, certainly in Seaside, is the bottom left there. The main reason to highlight that is the occurrence of those bridges. You have to get across both the Nehalem and the Nehalem. to get east up to high ground, and those bridges are likely to fail.
And the Nehalem here.
Yep. It turns out that in the case of Seaside, you can save more lives by thinking about building vertical evacuation structures. That's a way to mitigate the hazard pretty significantly down there. So how are these data being used? Well, many different ways. Obviously, there's been a lot of work by people to develop evacuation products. These are maps. These are printed brochures. We've been developing web-based products that you can dial in, enter your address. It'll tell you whether you're in the tsunami zone or not. If you use the web portal, it'll actually, when you enter your address, it'll actually give you an evacuation route. And I'll show an example of that in a minute. We also have a smartphone. There's an app called Tsunami Evac that you can download. It's available for both iOS and Android. It currently doesn't have the capability to show your evacuation route, but it'll actually tell you whether you're in the zone or not, which is still extremely important. And it also receives warnings from the Tsunami Warning Center if an event happens anywhere in the Pacific Rim. We have various tsunami overlay zones, so they're used for, these are the 5 t-shirt size tsunami zones that are used for development purposes or for guidance on critical facilities. We also been developing, working with the Department of Land Conservation Development, developing what we call evacuation facility improvement plans. So these are for use with guiding signage, or could be used to make a case for retrofitting bridges, or maybe making a case for building vertical evacuation structures. And then, of course, a lot of this information is already being used, particularly here, but also up and down the Oregon coast for mass care planning. That's such a critical part. Thinking about, it's important to be thinking about and being prepared for the before, but also we need to be thinking about what's going to happen afterwards. And then, of course, I mentioned vertical evacuation twice there, and the only example on the Oregon coast is the Hatfield Marine Science Center down in Newport, a phenomenal building designed to safeguard about 1,000 people. On the Washington coast, from work that they've been doing, I think there's, as far as I'm aware, I think there's 3 in place already, and there's probably a 4th that's underway to be constructed. They needed something on the order of 50 vertical evacuation structures to service all their communities, because their landscape is quite different from ours. Broader sandy beaches and barrier spits, and high ground is a long way away. Whereas on the Oregon coast, we're very fortunate in that a lot of our coastline, high ground is actually very close to our communities. And so it's very survivable. There are only a few places on the Oregon coast that are, truly where it could be a challenge. And those communities are already working towards trying to address those challenges. What have we been doing to prepare? So I touched on obviously some of those, but a lot of the work has been really driven towards improving signage, both along Highway 101. So all those entering and leaving tsunami signs that you see, probably get bored with. That's one effort. It's to remind our visitors that you are entering a potentially dangerous area, a hazardous area. We've put in a lot of "You Are Here" signs in virtually every community. And again, that's a reminder to reach out to our visitor population, to give them maps on the ground at a key point and be able to direct them to high ground. We've developed what we call Beat the Wave maps, which are embedded into the routing capabilities on the web-based portal, where we actually give you estimates of the time, or rather the speed you need to be moving in order to get from point A to point B to get to high ground. I'll push back on what Linda said about walking out of your inundation zone. I would say move as fast as you can. Don't dally. That's the most important thing. Move as fast as you can. There is guidance about how quickly you need to be going. So there are places on the Oregon coast where you actually have to run in order to reach high ground. And while it may sound terrible, I would also remind you that our evacuation maps are really skewed to the biggest event. It's a much, reality is it's probably not likely to be that big. So that means that every step that you take towards high ground you're improving your survivability. And I think that's the most important thing to take away from this is, don't be put off by the fact that our XXL shows high ground a long way away. Every step that you move in the direction of that high ground increases your chances of survival. So that's an important point. We've been working with emergency management, OEM in particular, and then obviously City of Cannon Beach and City of Newport and various other places to establish these tsunami caches. These are for post-disaster preparation. And then obviously we've been doing a tremendous amount of what we call hazardous risk-based type analyses to look at exposure and so on. So this is a view of the web-based portal. This is the Tsunami Evac. This is hosted by NANUS, which is the Northwest Association of Network Ocean Observing System. We partnered with NANUS about 15 years ago to begin developing a tsunami portal. And it's evolved into a really powerful feature. And I am not aware of any product like this anywhere in the world. And if someone finds one, let me know. When we started with this, it just simply had a map of the inundation zone showing the distance event, which is in orange, the local event in yellow, and safety is in green. We've provide links as you zoom into a particular location, a city, anywhere in Oregon and Washington. It'll actually provide links to the published PDFs of the evacuation maps. So you can actually download those evacuation maps as a PDF in the app there. There's also a tool in there called Custom Brochure. So you could zoom into your particular house, click on the custom brochure, and it'll produce a little map of your area. Unfortunately, it's not a great product, and we're working to try to correct that and make something better that I think will be very exciting in the future. And then, of course, the most recent sort of advancement to it is the incorporation of these beat the wave maps that we've been doing over the years, doing evacuation modeling, where you can simply enter your address and it'll actually pop up the little blue dots there. Of course, this is Seaside. And on the right-hand side there, it'll give you instructions. It'll tell you how fast you need to be going from that location. So in this example here, you need to be moving at a jog speed. And it'll give you an information about the distance and things like that. And again, don't be disillusioned about the speed that's mentioned there. Go as fast as you can, and every step you make in that direction towards high ground, you're increasing your chance of survival. And then I touched on the app. And you can, if you scan that QR code, you can get access to all this sort of stuff. Where can I find more information? Well, the best place is probably to go to the Oregon Tsunami Clearinghouse. Just search www.oregontsunami.org and you'll find this particular site there. It'll give you access to every evacuation map that we produce. It gives you access to all the Beat the Wave products. You can get links to the Tsunami portal and the Tsunami apps. You can see products where you can compare a distant map versus a local map using that upper little sliding tool. The idea there was that people get confused about the role of the distance zone or the orange zone versus the yellow zone. Well, if you're in the orange zone, you're also in the yellow zone. That's the most important thing to keep in mind. If you're in the orange zone, doesn't mean that you're not in the yellow zone. And some people get confused by that. So the point is that anywhere that's not green, you're in a Cascadia zone. So we built a little tool to help people understand that. So what does the future hold? Well, I kind of touched on this right at the very beginning. There's a tremendous amount of work going on in the region by both academics as well as the US Geological Survey. So a few years ago, in partnership with the USGS, the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, and efforts from Oregon, we put together a meeting in Fort Collins to begin to evaluate effectively the next generation of earthquake sources for the region. And the outcome of that meeting was very successful. It basically has led to the development of a suite of whole new sources that eventually will be turned into new tsunami models over the next decade and beyond. Is it going to change things in terms of maps that we've got right now? Probably not. But it's important for us to be going down in this direction because it has implications for building codes and building vertical evacuation structures, which are currently based on older earthquake sources and modeling that has fundamental problems associated with them that we're trying to correct now. There's two huge efforts, one being run by what's called the COPES Hub, based out of the University of Washington and Oregon State University, called the Cascadia COPES Hub. And they're focused on looking at what they call acute hazards, so landslides, tsunami type events, great earthquakes, and then chronic hazards. So these are coastal erosion effects, extreme storms, those sort of things. So there's a lot of work being directed at those areas. They're doing tsunami modeling up in places like Seaside and elsewhere. And then most recently, Diego Melgar, he's a professor at University of Oregon, received about $15 million to set up an earthquake research center here in the Pacific Northwest. Fantastic. And so they're actually delving into earthquake geophysics, tsunami modeling, paleoseismology, so looking for earthquake signs and things like that over the next 5 years, and they're likely to extend that into even to 10 years. And so that's really, really important and is good news for us. You probably can't see it in the map on the right there, but you can see some little dots out on the continental shelf there with sort of arrows pointing in direction. So folks at the University of Washington have put out basically seismometers out on the continental shelf, both beyond the deformation front as well as on the shelf itself, to actually try to measure earthquake signals out on the shelf there. And the goal is to actually ramp this up to have many more of these devices out there. Researchers are using fiber optic cables as another means to detect tsunami signals and detect the earthquakes. People are using high frequency radar to try to track tsunami propagation. Obviously that's after the event has happened. So there's just a massive, massive amount of research that's going on in the region, and the goal being to obviously get to the point where Japan has been for some time. And earthquake early warning obviously fits into that as well. And I'm just about to wrap up. So I just wanted to show, so this is the original, this is where we started off, and I'm not expecting you to understand this, but this is kind of where, in order to develop these earthquake sources, we have to sort of parameterize characteristics about the frequency of the events, the size of the earthquakes, whether it's going to be a splay fault or a deep rupture type mechanism. This was the original approach that DOGAMI took along with other colleagues to produce the maps that we have today. And this is where we're going as we go to the future. This is a much, much more complicated product with many hundreds to thousands of potential scenarios incorporating some of the best available science. So there's been some recent work done by Susan Cabot and others just published a few weeks ago, where they've actually been doing seismic imaging along the continental shelf. And so this is providing a wealth of new information about the characteristics of the subduction zone. So in those grainy looking maps on the side there, those are out across on the continental shelf, diving tens of kilometers down into the Earth's crust and capturing the top of the subducting crust itself as it goes below the continental shelf. And using information from those types of map products, they can actually develop new slab models of the Cascadia region. So it's a very exciting development, and again, this work is ongoing. So I think I've talked enough. I think the most important message to again just remind you all is in terms of minimizing loss of life in this community or anywhere on the coast as you travel, comes down to a simple messaging. It's the drop, cover, and hold in the event of the earthquake. So get yourself in a safe position, under a table, under a chair, that type of thing. Hold on. The earthquake shaking may be 3 to 5 minutes. Importantly, ahead of the time, know your evacuation maps. You have the capacity to find evacuation maps for anywhere on the Oregon coast. You can find maps on the Washington coast as well. You can find them down in Northern California in the Eureka, Humboldt Bay area. They're out there. Know your maps. And I think the most important thing of all is once you know your maps, practice. Yeah, hopefully a few more times than that, but practice walking your evacuation route so that you actually know it. Ideally, practice it in the evening time when things are a little bit darker, but practice it repeatedly. Don't just do it once. And do it, you should be aware of anywhere you are on the coast. I mean, it's just part of being prepared. When I travel up and down the coast, I'm always figuring out, well, where am I going to go? So practice it. And then, of course, as Linda has alluded to, you need to have go bags to get you through the first 72 hours. But also you need to be 2 weeks ready. This is what Oregon Emergency Management is now recommending. 2 weeks ready of food supplies and water, etc. And there are easy ways to get at some of these things like water. Think about rain barrels. You could put a rain barrel on the end of your downspout and you've got water there. It may not be great water, but you can recycle it fairly easily. You can purify it. There are ways, but it's water. I mean, those rain barrels hold 60 gallons. That can last you quite a significant amount of time. So there's simple things that you can do to prepare yourselves for a disaster like this. And if you're prepared, your chances of surviving unscathed are pretty good. And I'll stop there. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Is Nehalem Mountain, would it help if a tsunami's coming up from the north, would it help block some of the tsunami coming to our area? Or would it does nothing?
So it depends on the earthquake. So if it's a cascade event, probably not, because the directionality in a subduction type event is always going to be orthogonal to the coast, so right angles to the coast. So it's actually going to drive waves in from the west towards the east. So in that sort of situation, it's probably not going to have an effect. It does have an effect in terms of distributing the wave, and maybe it can actually cause, as the wave refracts around headlands, or more importantly around submarine banks, even canyons, so if you look at Stonewall Bank, which is off Newport, it has a massive effect on a Cascadia tsunami in terms of distributing energy away and around into other areas, and can cause enhanced run-up and things like that. So it all depends. In a distant event, again, probably not. Yeah. Lots of, ma'am.
I happen to be here in my grandfather's front yard on First Street during the '64.
Okay. Yep.
We were sitting in the yard with our babies. My baby is now 60. And the policeman came by and told us we needed to evacuate immediately. And his instructions to then get in the car and drive up to the Neocani view site. And so we did.
Okay.
And that's where we all evacuated until we were told that we could go back. And that was before the sirens.
Yes.
And et cetera. And so the job of the local policeman was to come by on First Street and tell anybody that he saw. And he stopped at our house because we had 5 little children there. To go up there. So we did. And I remember the damage in Cannon Beach, and not so much, in Manzanita.
Yep.
But we certainly evacuated. And now I work for the food bank in Nehalem, and they're still talking about how the church there, who has a kitchen, an official certified kitchen, and NCRD that has space, how to make plans for sheltering and food provision for people who are displaced.
That's good.
So we've evacuated to high ground, and the wave has arrived. What kind of guidance is there for when it's safe to return?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from all the modeling work that's been done, it's it's about 12 hours of large waves. So because of the type of rupture mechanism that would happen out here, all our modeling indicates that the first wave is going to be the biggest wave. But there will be large waves impacting the area over time. And what we've found is that at around about hour 10 to hour 12, it's starting to really dissipate quite a bit. There are places on the Oregon coast where it's not quite as simple as that. So if you go up if the wave goes into, as it goes into the Columbia River estuary, if it arrives, there are strong sort of tidal effects that can actually come into play up there. And so you actually may experience longer periods of high wave activity in somewhere like the Columbia River, as well as down by the Umpqua River, down in the reed sport area, because of, again, unique sort of characteristics about those sort of places. But in general, about 12 hours is the expected timeline.
How do you experience, what was he putting it in? All right. Well, I've never understood the subsidence thing. Is it like you're in your house and it's like an elevator, it just drops down?
Instantaneously.
It's
Yeah,
what?
it's fast. Yes, it would happen instantly.
Instantly?
Yeah.
Oh my, like
Yeah.
we're like
Seconds.
7 or 12 feet in our house, I think.
Yeah. So I mean,
Could you repeat the question, please, so that...
So the question was how quickly would the co-seismic response happen, and by all accounts it would happen very quickly. So it's near instant, and so in terms of the amount of co-seismic response, that's the work that the paleoseismologists have been investigating. So the best available data right now points to somewhere on the order of about 3 to 6 feet along our coastline, and it varies. It tends to be higher down on the south coast. And so when you look at our biggest earthquake scenarios, the XXL, the co-seismic response down in the Gold Beach area is about 15 feet of lowering.
Now, is it even or is it sort of crumpled?
It's crumpled. Yep.
Wonderful.
Yep. It's crumpled. Ma'am?
Going on with the subsidence, I mean, I recall in 2020 looking at the Nehalem case study, which showed the subsidence over the past 4 or 5 earthquakes was about 3 feet in
Yep.
this area.
Yep.
And I recall, or maybe I hallucinated, different advice last fall about what to do in the earthquake, not the tsunami, but the earthquake. If you're able to discern the P wave or the primary wave, expecting it to be more gentle, that's the sign you get out of your house. You run. Because the secondary wave is going to be the long one, and you can be crushed if you cover in your house. But your house is probably coming down. Did I hallucinate that, or?
We hope so.
So the question is what to do in an earthquake, and is there time to really evacuate? And so this is a somewhat sort of controversial area. From emergency management, it's very straightforward. Drop, cover, and hold. That's the message that's being repeatedly expressed. If you're outside, I mean, the thing to appreciate is that that long P wave is still going to be pretty significant. And so you may not be able to actually move easily. You only have to look at some of the videography that came out of Japan. Keep in mind, wood frame homes, by all accounts, in terms of crustal type earthquakes and even subduction type earthquakes, survive really well because they actually have a lot of flexibility in them. So wood frame buildings are likely to be okay. The building may come off its foundations, but you may still be okay. If you're in a concrete building, unreinforced masonry, it's bad news. I mean, those are more likely to collapse, and we know that, and we've seen that. Large multi-story buildings are probably going to be okay. I know that Chris Goldfinger was actually in Tohoku at the time of the 2011 event, and I know he's sort of thrown this idea out about evacuating at the time of the earthquake. I think, again, I think the reality is, in the situation, you drop, cover, and hold and ride it out, and then get to safety as quickly as possible. Otherwise, we're going to have confused messages, and people are going to die because of mixed responses.
I didn't hallucinate, it was crystal finger.
Yeah. Ma'am?
How, in terms of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami results, I mean, how did that match up to what they were predicting? Were there any surprises? That I'm just thinking ahead for us.
Well, there were. So the question is about the Tohoku event and whether it matched what they were expecting. And the short answer is no. They underestimated the scale of that event. They did not expect it to be ever as big as it was, and so it was a tough lesson. Obviously, they have invested huge amounts of money in terms of building seawalls, which in many areas actually either failed or were overtopped. Where they were successful was building vertical evacuation structures, and as far as I'm aware, I think they all performed well. There were many issues related to fatalities where people would attempt to go back into the inundation zone to find family, loved ones, and those people died. So they recommend, for example, that the priority should be yourself is number one priority, is to get out of the zone. If your family are obviously with you, then you all go together. But you get out as fast as possible. And you certainly don't go back into the inundation zone. Those that did died. And there are many examples of that. Actually, I know, ma'am, yep.
With the evacuation areas that you see going up and down, say you're driving down 101 and it's okay, you're in the clear up here, and okay, now you're entering the tsunami zone again. Is that based primarily on elevation? Does it have to do with the type of ground that's underneath? What is the elevation, and does that take into consideration any kind of drop?
Yeah, good question. So answer your last question first. So the question is about the entering and leaving signs along Highway 101, and do they reflect run-up elevations or some other factor? And does the modeling account for the co-seismic response? So I'll answer the last one first. Yes. All our modeling incorporates that co-seismic response. So it accounts for NXL, XXL, 15 feet of dropping of the coast down in Gold Beach, 3 to 6 feet along the central coast, and something comparable, a little bit more on the north coast, up on the further north. So it accounts for that. It accounts for, it's based on elevation, and it's based on the run-up elevation from the modeling. And so what you need to be aware of is that run-up elevation varies spatially along the coast. So on average, along the open coast, the run-up elevations in XXL are somewhere on the order of about 70 to 90 feet. On the south coast, they increase to well over 100 feet, even approaching 120 feet. In places like the estuaries, then the run-up elevations drop obviously to a few tens of feet, because it's being distributed across a low-lying, broader area. So you just need to appreciate that all that signage is based on the model run-ups and accounts for all those sort of effects. Yep. Yep.
I have a question regarding liquefaction. Our city, a lot of the homes are built on a lot of sand. Is liquefaction only when there's a lot of water involved, or is there a concern being built on all that sand?
Tom, do you want to answer that?
Sure. If you have sand in the form of sand dunes, which is what Manzanita has, it's not dangerous if the sand is young, is old, and has had decades to compact. And the sands that, I'm having a senior moment. You don't have to worry about tsunamis in most of liquefaction in most of Manzanita, because the sand is up above the water table.
Yep.
and it's old and it's been compacted by time, so it won't affect your house.
Yeah, so liquefaction is much more likely to impact you in low-lying areas or adjacent to creeks, like buildings along Nehalem, in downtown Seaside there. You can experience liquefaction in those types of areas. You can also experience what we call lateral spreading, where the ground actually slides in towards the river channels as well. So,
A few years ago, we were extending the sewer line in Wheeler and dug down between 22 and 25 feet. There was an undisturbed layer of beach sand. Do you think that was due to plate tectonics of lifting or a tsunami in the way it passed?
I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to look at it.
Have to look at that. Okay,
Yeah.
second question was the USGS shake map. Is that delayed by 5 minutes, the one that's real-time online, or is that just as real as it gets?
That's a great question. I'm not sure the answer to that one either. I suspect there will be a time delay because they need to actually refine their estimates first of the intensity of the earthquake itself and the location of it. The magnitude typically will start to come out as people start to report. So a lot of it's guided by reporting from people. Did you feel the quake? And people upload that information. So there is definitely a delay factor. I just don't know how long.
I thought that it was like there's a global string of seismometers all the way around everywhere. They keep putting them in.
There are, yes, there are, but it still takes time to actually, georeference off those sensors to identify where exactly it happened and the type of event. I mean, it still takes time. Yeah, ma'am.
Near County Mountain, how solid is it? Do we have to worry about it's going to crumble in the earthquake down to the houses below?
So Near County Mountain is comprised of basalt, so it's probably okay, but there are major landslides along the face of Near County Mountain that could be triggered in a great earthquake, as it's likely to be triggered up and down the Oregon coast. I mean, that's one of the, again, so if you think about, so a few years ago in Kaikoura, New Zealand, there was a massive earthquake down there. It was about I think it was about a 7.8. They had something on the order of 3,000 landslides. It was some large number, thousands of landslides that actually impacted the Highway 1 that goes down to Christchurch and basically cut off the northern part of the South Island to the southern part. So it's a great analogy for what we might experience on the Oregon coast. We know that, basically every community on the Oregon coast will become islands, effectively, that are going to be isolated from each other. And that's why, as Linda said, you need to be prepared for the long time, because the feds aren't going to be, the emergency services aren't going to be coming into our communities, probably not for several days at the earliest. And they're going to be targeting probably larger areas before they hit our locales. Yep. Ma'am.
So you drop and cover and hold for the first big quake. Do you get out from under that and get out of the building before the second quake happens? How fast is it before the second quake hit?
So it could be fast. I would be, as soon as the big event has happened, the short answer is I'd be trying to go as fast as I can.
Book it.
I'd book it.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be waiting around. As soon as you can actually get out after the first event, I'd be gone. If you can get going even earlier and it's feasible, I'd go.
And if
you're in a tent outside, you don't have the same sort of restrictions.
Yeah.
Your biggest restriction is whether you can actually walk and move on a moving terrain. And again, you only have to look at the Japan examples to get a sense of the severity of the shaking. It's hard to move while it's going.
So you said you're number one and you take care of yourself. If you got somebody that's handicapped, well, you book it anyway and worry about them later?
So the Japanese would say yes.
Yeah. I mean,
if you wait around, you'll die.
Yeah,
two of you will die. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but that's
why you're here.
Yeah.
To say that.
Yep.
That's why I asked it.
Sorry, I'll come next.
So,
hang on.
Personal question here. Between Wheeler, Nehalem, and Manzanita, we start feeling a quake, where do you want to be? Where are you
Of
going to
those
feel
three
safest?
places.
I'm sorry, between where?
Wheeler, Nehalem, and Manzanita. Where are you going to feel safest? You know.
Well, it depends whether I'm in the tsunami zone or not.
Yes, but if you know the geology, you know the geography here.
I think depending on where you are in proximity to your tsunami zone, all three would be fine. I mean, Wheeler is well up the estuary there. The tsunami zone is not, is kind of lapping up at the base of the town there. Nehalem, you're close to high ground again, it's lapping up. Here, the tsunami actually extends quite a ways up Lanita Ave here. So obviously, because you're open coast as well, so you're bearing the full brunt of it. So there are going to be those differences. So
a similar question to what you just heard. We're about a quarter mile from the ocean right now. If we had something this instant, what are you going to do?
Bye. See you.
Well, I mean, in all seriousness, we all gather like this from time to time, whether it's in church or meetings like this or grocery stores. What do you do?
Well, again, I would drop, cover, and hold. I would actually try to cover your heads where you are in place, depending on the event itself, and then as soon as you can actually move safely, I'd be out the door and I'd be going to high ground.
How fast a runner are you?
Well, I used to be fast, but I've slowed down. Sir.
This is a curiosity question. I can understand why there's much more energy released when you have a large subduction zone type rupture than on a smaller one. But it seems like too with the long rupture like we have along Cascadia, if it's an entire one, you're also involving a lot more land area. Therefore that energy release is distributed over much more land area. So it seems surprising to me that the force of it isn't more mitigated by the fact that you've got all that land area.
No, it doesn't come into play. I mean, this is, again, you're talking about tens of meters of a stress that's accumulated over hundreds of years across a large portion that's basically locked, and when it goes with a lot of energy. And I mean, again, you only have to look at Japan and the magnitude of the damage that was caused by that earthquake. You look at all the past examples. No, it's still going to be a big event. It's not mitigating that.
All right, I think that's about all the time we have. John, can you stay just a little bit?
Sure.
After? So he'll be available to answer questions after, but let's give him a big round.